Hi, I'm Karin Zissis of ASCOA Online. October 29th wasn't a great day for Gustavo Petro. That Sunday, Colombians voted in big elections for governors, mayors, council members, and other local roles. And the results didn't bode all that well for Petro's presidency.
Han pasado 2 horas desde el cierre de las urnas y los resultados de las elecciones locales y regionales en Colombia ya son muy fuertes y muy claros.
Let's take the mayoral race in Bogotá, for instance. The capital city, where Petro himself was once mayor, saw his candidate not only lose, but also miss out on second place. In Colombia's second city, Medellín, a fierce Petro critic won with over 70% of the vote. Other major cities shared similar storylines.
I think the overall pessimism that Colombia has in terms of security, corruption, the economy, education, the implementation of the peace deal, all of these things were partly factored into voters' choices.
Our guest today is Sergio Guzmán, the director of Colombia Risk Analysis, a political risk consultancy based in Bogotá. He spoke to my colleague John Orbach about what the electoral results say about the mood in Colombia and why these votes served as a referendum on the president. Thank you for being with us. You can help us spread the word. Write us a review, give us 5 stars, and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Sergio Guzman, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. I wanted to start off by asking, we've seen a lot of discussion about how these regional elections were a referendum on Petro's governance so far. To what degree is that true?
Well, so we think it was a big blow for President Petro because ultimately it was the only chance that Colombians at the poll had an opportunity to either reassert or have him face consequences for his year and 4 months in office. And so during the run-up to the election, a lot of Petro's supporters were trying to reinforce the narrative, this isn't a referendum on the president. The local politics is local, etc. But it further cemented the fact that it was a referendum, that Petro so actively, indirectly, but still very actively, tried to participate in the elections, both sliming his opponents or people that are affiliated with traditional parties, or trying to go to China to actively participate in the undergrounding of the Bogotá Metro project, or the resignation of key allies like Daniel Quintero and Carlos Caicedo weeks before the election to actively campaign for their preferred candidate. So in a way, not seeing it as a referendum would do a disservice, really, to the analysis. Furthermore, I think the overall pessimism that Colombia has in terms of security, corruption, the economy, education, the implementation of the peace deal, all of these things were partly factored into voters' choices. And so I think ignoring that and trying to say, this had nothing to do with the administration would also be naive.
So I wanted to ask you specifically about Bogotá. In that city, Carlos Fernando Galán outperformed polls and got the biggest win in the city's history, in the first round, no less. And Petro's candidate, Gustavo Bolívar, didn't even finish second in the race. But Bogotá has a tendency to vote left to some extent. So could you tell me, who is Galán and why did he appeal to voters?
So Carlos Fernando Galán had been a member of the city council. He had been a senator. He had been a representative. He has very high name recognition in Bogotá. So, he does have a track record in Bogotá. He has been, working the political circuit in the city. So he's not necessarily an unknown quantity in Bogotá. But most critically and most importantly, Carlos Fernando Galán was the most viable candidate to oppose Gustavo Bolívar. And ever since, the polls started when the campaign was fully on, starting, say, in June, July, Carlos Fernando was the clear runner-up, the front runner in the polls, and Gustavo Bolívar lagged by leaps and bounds. And because Bogotá, for this one occasion, and in the future, we have the ability to have a runoff election between the two runners-up, a lot of people, I think, particularly on the right, decided to vote against their first preference, which would have been, say, a Diego Molano or a former General Vargas, and instead voted for Carlos Fernando Galán in order to avoid a runoff scenario. In addition to that, Gustavo Bolívar didn't even make it to second place in these elections. So not only did Carlos Fernando Galán go well beyond the 40% threshold, he received 49% of the vote, but Daniel Oviedo received the second most votes. So it was definitely and certainly a blow to President Petro in Bogotá. Mind you, also before the election, right before the election, President Petro had proposed not just undergrounding the Bogotá metro and that the nation would pay 100% of the cost, but that perhaps we should have a plebiscite to decide should the metro be overground or underground. And what Carlos Fernando Galán and many other candidates said, this election is the referendum. This election is the plebiscite to do that. And in that sense, I think certainly voters expressed themselves overwhelmingly about that circumstance.
So let's go to Medellín. Tell me a little bit about Federico Gutiérrez, Fico Gutiérrez.
Esta no es una discusión alrededor de la izquierda, la derecha o el centro. Esta es una discusión alrededor del sentido común.
He's Medellin's new mayor with over 70% of the vote. He was the mayor in the past. He won the race, with over 70% of the vote. What should we know about him?
I think the critical issue about Federico Gutiérrez that people should know is for Medellin voters, he's a known quantity. He used to be mayor, and when he left the mayoralty, he was at close to 80% approval. One of the Medellin mayors with the highest approval ratings leaving office. But the mayoralty of Daniel Quintero during these 3 years has been so disappointing for many people in Medellin. There's been so many corruption allegations, there's been so much distrust, mismanagement in how the city runs its parks, other operations, how the city faces corruption, allegations of nepotism, etc., that voters really did have a referendum on Daniel Quintero as well. His preferred candidate, Juan Carlos Upegui, only got 11% of the vote, which is really, really meager. So Medellin voters overwhelmingly, with close to 74% of the vote, voted for Federico Gutiérrez, partly because he's a known quantity, but partly in protest of the current mayoralty of Medellin, who, again, is a very important ally of President Petro and is on the sounding boards to become Minister of Technology. So the real issue is, why should Petro reward a person or a political ally who's been so overwhelmingly defeated in a local election to appoint a successor? I'm not sure.
So I want to zoom out a little bit again and look at, the electoral results maps. So if you look at the results from 2019 and then you look at those from this year, they actually look pretty similar. Is this a return to Colombia's pre-Petro status quo that so many protested against? Or how do you explain the similarities in these results?
Well, bear with me, John, because I think right now, Colombia, we have 36 different political parties. And with this sort of hodgepodge of political parties, there are many candidates, a litany of them, who've been endorsed by multiple parties, often at opposite ends of the political and ideological spectrum. So what we have now is a less clean picture to suggest something like you just said, because what we have is actually a more confusing outlook. We have people like Dilian Francisca Toro, who's been, the leader of the U Party since forever. She was endorsed by 10 parties. We have a member of the Partido Liberal and Cambio Radical, who's been also endorsed by the Centro Democrático in San Andrés and Providencia, but because another member of Petro's coalition also endorsed him, Petro's claiming that victory as one of his own. So instead of saying, we went back to 2019 or pre-Petro times, I think we're entering a much more confusing and convoluted era in Colombian politics, where it's going to be important for the listeners out there to be much more mindful of the inside baseball of Colombian politics, because it's not going to get simpler. In fact, we think it's going to get more confusing.
Interesting. So in that same vein then, Sergio, there's been a lot of focus on Bogotá and Medellín, but are there storylines from elsewhere that kind of help explain what you're talking about, what happened in these elections?
Well, I think one of the interesting storylines is what happened in Barranquilla. Because in Barranquilla, we very much did not have an anti-incumbent vote. In fact, Jaime Pumarejo has been replaced by Alex Char, who has been the mayor of Barranquilla. This is going to be his third stint at the job. And Alex Char is of the same party and sort of political clan as Mayor Pumarejo. And so, in a way, voters in Barranquilla voted for continuity, despite many credible corruption allegations against the Char clan, the Cambio Radical party, about Arturo Char, Alex's brother, being already indicted by the Attorney General for vote buying allegations in the 2018 elections and 2019 elections. And so instead, one would think that many voters would take an opportunity to punish wrongdoers in the polls in Barranquilla, but instead they seem to have done the opposite. In fact, there was even a book called La Costa Nostra that was written about this family and allegations surrounding their corruptions. It made the national headlines, etc. And voters still were unrelenting in their support of the Char family. So, it is another example of how these regional political establishments are not part of a very neat and clean narrative at the national level.
I see. So, anti-incumbency is not a storyline that holds true for the entire country. So maybe it's a little bit premature to talk about Colombia's 2026 presidential elections, but in your view, do these results have any bearing on that?
Yeah, well, I think like they say in the races, the gun has gone off, right? And the race begins now. So yes, we can talk about it. It is premature because we have a lot of laps left to go. And we have a lot of events that are going to shape Colombian politics going forward. But there's a number of things that are clear. First, incumbent at the national level, incumbents are at a disadvantage. So the left and people who support President Petro, all things considered and all things staying the same, are at a huge disadvantage compared to some of the right-wing or even centrist contenders. Number two, I think it's important. Colombia continues to be a country that's very sensitive to global shocks. So global shocks in demand, global shocks in supply, wars, geopolitical conflict, things like this could certainly affect the outlook for Colombia in the near future. More importantly, also, the US election is going to happen in 2024, and how Petro reacts to the next president of the United States may also bear on voters' minds come 2026, because we've already seen his reaction to the conflict in Israel and his involvement in some of the geopolitical tug of war globally, and how Colombians are not necessarily very happy with Petro's decisions on some of these things. So those could also definitely affect the outcome of the 2026 race. For now, we're watching the center and the center right to see what are the leadership approaches many of them have. Because it's clear that if they sort of take as an exclusively anti-Petro stance, they're not going to learn from the things that brought Petro to the forefront. His ideas of inclusion, his ideas of representativity, his ideas of having Afro-Colombians, indigenous people become part of the central conversation in politics in Colombia. So if they don't take an approach that learns lessons from why Gustavo Petro's ascent was so clear, I think we're going to be doomed to repeat a lot of mistakes.
Sergio, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say anything that I didn't ask, anything that you feel is relevant to this conversation.
No, look, John, I think it's important for the United States and American audiences not to ignore the internal politics of a country like Colombia. not only are we a very important hemispheric ally, but we're also, a country that is geopolitically and strategically important. And although local elections can often be dismissed as these are things that only affect national politics, bear in mind that these are important milestones politically for a country to have. And so at Colombia Risk Analysis, we're super engaged in these issues on a day-to-day level, and we're happy to continue explaining them to U.S. audiences, to clients, and to other foreign correspondents that are looking and tracking at Colombia. So happy to continue doing that.
So Sergio, when you talk about the importance of following Colombia's local elections, what are we missing? What's important to know here?
Look, John, there's ongoing conflicts in Ukraine. There's ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. There are ongoing conflicts in Africa. And they don't seem to be de-escalating. In fact, quite the opposite. Latin America is a very, interesting exception to that trend in interstate conflict. And that's not always going to hold true. I think there are rising tensions between different leaders in Latin America that we ought to be mindful about. We're not, in the Latin America of the 1960s, but we still look at Latin America kind of through that lens. And I think that that's a mistake. Social unrest, I think youth movements, I think there is a lot of rural-urban divide in a lot of things. And that's dry tinder for all sorts of conflict that could happen in Latin America. So I think that that's certainly something we're going to pay attention to, and you're also going to be paying attention to at ASCOA.
Well, Sergio, thank you so much for your time, as always. Always a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, John, and thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Karin Zissis. This episode was produced by John Orbach. Luisa Lemmy is the executive producer. The music in this podcast is Gentil Montaña, performed by the Fabian Forero Trio for America Society. Check the podcast notes for a link to watch the full video and find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can access other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast. And we'd love to hear from you. So send us your feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. You can get both those links in the podcast notes. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.